Hello, good afternoon. It's really a great pleasure to welcome you to our annual conference, What is Nature in Human Nature? We are delighted that so many of you have come, and a warm welcome also to our speakers who have traveled to Berggasse from various European countries, but also from the United States and from South Africa. We look forward to exchanging ideas together over the next day and a half. Hermann Westering, Vice Chairman of the Advisory Board of the Sigmund Freud Foundation, and I jointly conceived the conference. And I have to say that we had to deal with a very smooth conference planning process. For instance, and this is really rare, all invitations were answered promptly and positively. This certainly has to do with the fact that some of the speakers and moderators belong to the Freud Research Group, the Freud Research Group network, but by no means all of them. So it probably has also to do with the topic and the title, which, as it is often the case here, which is deliberately designed to be very open in order to gather different perspectives and disciplines on a socio-politically relevant topic. The conference is in dialogue with our annual theme for 2025. We have chosen the topic of being human, which we are exploring in different formats, be it this annual conference, be it a web presentation by our advisory board members, or a special exhibition which will open in October. While this special exhibition, entitled The Case of Freud, Documents of Injustice, will take us back to the Nazi years and the Shoah, and thus demonstrates how the human subject became a mere number intended for annihilation, while this exhibition stages the dehumanization which took place during these years. The conference is concerned with questions whose answers seem more urgent than ever today. How can we remain human in the face of rapid technological progress, and what does psychoanalysis have to contribute? During the conception of the conference, we had to mourn the tragic passing of a friend of the museum, Donna Orange, who came to Vienna in 2018 as a Fulbright Freud visiting lecturer of psychoanalysis, and whose intersubjective stance and philosophical and social science studies were very close to the questions of the conference. We therefore have decided to dedicate the conference to Donna Orange, who was representing and living a psychoanalysis that stands for empathy and social responsibility. Both empathy and social responsibility seem central to us, especially these days when we are looking at the rampage it creates with bewilderment and sadness. Our sympathy goes out to the families of the victims and all those affected, all young people who are now experiencing their schools as a place of danger just a few weeks before the school vacation will start. Psychoanalytic insight is more relevant and helpful and necessary than ever before. But now let me hand over to Hermann.
Thank you, Daniela. I would height. I would also like to take the opportunity to welcome you all here at the Freud Museum. As Daniela already mentioned, this conference is related to this year's annual motto, Being Human. It was actually Jenny Wilner who came up with the title of the conference, What is Nature in Human Nature? Jenny Wilner has not arrived yet. I'm afraid she's traveling with the Deutsche Bahn, so it can take a while. The reference to nature seems only one way of thinking being human. At this very moment in time, it appears that the question of being human begs for reflections on humanism, on human rights, human dignity, instead of identities on ethics and morality that are not just defined in ideological or nationalist terms. For Freud, I think, the question of what it means to live in culture, to be culturized, to be a moral agent and to participate in communities can never be answered without considering nature. Nature as the hostile environment human beings seek to protect themselves from, and especially also the inner nature, the multiplicity of drives, needs, affects, and physiological and psychic capacities and functions that human beings may or may not share with animals and other life forms. For Freud, the question what defines human nature entails a reflection on the continuities and discontinuities between animality and humanity, nature and culture, and on the question how to think human interactions within larger ecological systems. Notably in the often speculative inquiries into the nature of human nature, we find Freud applying and further developing key concepts from a body of scientific knowledge, notably physics and biology, and one of the topics in this conference will exactly address Freud's relation to various scientific fields. Today, we also find ourselves in the age of the Anthropocene and transhumanism, which maybe marks nothing less than the beginning of a new era. The developments, for example, in artificial intelligence and robotics are spectacular. The new constellation of humans and digitalization with the aim of optimizing human capacities raises important questions and challenges our old humanistic values. What role does psychoanalysis play in this discourse? How can psychoanalytic concepts help us to meet these challenges? Or to what extent is it inevitable to expand psychoanalysis in the sense of post-human or post-anthropocentric thinking? These and other related questions will be explored in the presentations in this interdisciplinary conference. I'm very much looking forward to our discussions this afternoon and tomorrow. And now I give back the floor to Daniela.
Thank you. So just a few words about the program. There will be 4 panels altogether, 1 today and 3 tomorrow. Immediately afterwards, we will be discussing psychoanalysis, philosophy and scientific knowledge with Ulrike Kistner from Pretoria, Ruud Welten from Rotterdam and Nadine Hartmann from Berlin. And this panel will be moderated by Malin Bidwell-Steiner from Vienna. We will make sure that this first panel ends as planned at 6:30, as at 7 p.m. there will be the opening of Schauraum Berggasse 19, curated by our director, Monika Pessler, with an installation and performance by Vienna-based artist Daniel Hafner. All this will take place in front of the showroom and at the Berggasse downstairs below, so on the street, and we would kindly invite you to a glass of wine afterwards. Tomorrow, on Friday, there will be 3 panels. We will start at 10 a.m. in the morning with the panel Bioanalysis and Biology with Hermann Westering, Jenny Wildner from Munich, and Raluca Sorenau from Access, moderated by Sam Adriansons. After a coffee break, the second panel will continue at noon, Human-Animal Encounter, with this year's Fulbright Freud Fellow, Max Cavich from Philadelphia, and Nicholas Ray from Leeds. The panel will be moderated by Dominik Drexler from Vienna. During the lunch break, which will run from 1:30 to 5:30, you will have the opportunity to visit the museum if you're interested in, free of charge, of course. You will receive stickers by us. The last panel is dedicated to post and transhumanism with Esther Hutfles from Vienna, Markus Kohlen from Vienna, Berlin, as well as Jill Sahlberg from New York. And who knows Donna Orange's work and legacy very well. The moderator of this panel is Giorgia Panteli from Vienna. All of this has beautifully been organized by our dear colleague Eva Maria Kleinschwärzer. Thank you, Eva, for your commitment. But now let us start with the first panel. Marlin Bidwell-Steiner will take over now for the moderation. Marlin is a literary and gender researcher at the Department of Romance Studies at the University of Vienna, and her research focuses on the history of body-mind concepts and emotions, literature and psychoanalysis, and fictionality. Thank you for your attention.
Yes. So it's a pleasure to be here and be part of this inspiring program. Before we start, let me briefly give you an overview on the procedure of this first session. Each speaker has about 20 to 25 minutes, so to facilitate afterwards an engaged exchange on the topics, and it will be my role to have a close eye on the schedule, and I hope you all will join me with a disciplined way, because artists are not to be let waited. So, it is my pleasure to introduce you our first speaker, Ulrike Kistner. She's a professor emerita at the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria, South Africa. Her research activities cover the fields of social theory, psychoanalytical theory, of course, and political philosophy. In this context, she has translated core texts such as the first edition of Sigmund Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, published in Verso in 2016. From her more recent works, I would like to mention only 2, which are representative of her wide-ranging interests. Quote, "Can Black Folk Dream in Theory? Psychoanalysis and /of/in coloniality, and anamnesis of a failed encounter." This is a chapter of the book How to Write the Global History of Knowledge Making, edited in 2021 by Johannes Feichtinger, Anil Bhati, and Cornelia Hülmbauer with Springer. And the other one, already maybe a possible bridge to the following speaker, is called Religion as Universal Obsessional Neurosis of Humanity, Rereading Freud on Religion. This is an article in the journal HTS, Theological Studies, volume 77 from 2021. Today, Ulrike Kistner takes up a core issue of the beginning of psychoanalysis. It's presumed and contested scientificity. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation and for coming into the ambit and the ambience of the beginnings of psychoanalysis, which are part of my topic today. Am I audible to the audience? Okay. So I'd like to talk, to explore the elaboration of an etiology of neurosis in Freud's work between partly Freud and Breuer, and partly Freud himself, between 1893 and 1906, and extending a little bit further to see what happened after 1906. At the zenith of his work, Freud was still at pains to put psychoanalysis onto a scientific footing. He was bemoaning what he deemed a great injustice, namely that people have refused to treat psychoanalysis like any other science, and he means natural science. Okay, Wissenschaft und Naturwissenschaft und Science, I think, correspond in the translation. Freud made a special case for the sciences of life, within which he wanted to locate psychoanalysis. But he eschewed the characterization of the natural sciences in terms of the deductive nomological model in which it is commonly cast. As a science of life, Freud averred, psychoanalysis would have to work through empirical investigation based on inductive reasoning, detecting patterns from specific observations gleaned from a case-by-case analysis towards general conclusions. A diagnosis could be confirmed only after the underlying causes and mechanisms have been understood. It is not coincidental that Freud defines his own role as that of a physician, ein Arzt, more often than that of Analytiker. That of the person seeking analysis and therapy as patient. Analysant only came into common parlance much later through the uses in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. And that of pathology as illness, as Krankheit, Erkrankung. But he felt snubbed by the discipline that he had hoped would provide a theoretical and clinical pivot for psychoanalytic theory and practice. Of the resistance to psychoanalysis on the part of the medical professions, from which one would have expected the closest attention to and the most comprehensive understanding of the concept of human and organic life, Freud writes, during the 19th century, medicine made tremendous advances, but it also showed a short-sighted misunderstanding of the most important and most difficult among the problems of life. So the problem of life looms large. In acknowledging the advances of medical science while berating them for their limitations, Freud takes more than one leaf from the studies of microbiologist, pathologist, and physician, military physician, Edwin Klebs. Freud's account of the resistances to psychoanalysis clearly echoes Klebs's quarrel with the medical professions for fanatically resisting innovative diagnostic and treatment methods. Not only did the dogmatic character of pathological anatomy, cellular pathology, and histology impede the development of diagnostics of microbial diseases, Klebs argued, it had not contributed anything significant to practical medicine, nor to the cure of these diseases. Treatment remained symptomatic at best and was left up to mystical or divine intervention at worst. We're coming to the divine, I think, in the next presentation. While Klebs conducted pioneering bacteriological research, he was not alone in the field. From the 1850s onwards, the limitations of symptomatic notions and treatments of disease were laid bare. Skepticism had been mounting over the legacy of classificatory medicine of the 18th century natural history and over vague and imprecise claims about disease causation. The incidence of infections and communicable diseases of both animals and humans presented pressing public health concerns, which is what impelled the quest for specific causes of specific diseases. In the process, the understanding and the very definition of etiology underwent a substantial shift. Medical scientists, since the mid-19th century, broke with all previous notions of disease causation, stipulating that a specific necessary cause must be identifiable for every case of a particular infectious disease. They arrived at new understandings of etiology by borrowing from philosophical principles of causality since David Hume. The close affinity between Klebs and Freud's arguments about disease suggests that Freud was, in fact, paying close heed to Klebs's works. Sorry, we have... Okay, the next one coming. Also on Freud's and Breuer's radar were Paul Julius Möbius's studies on hysteria. Insisting that the nervous disorders must be treated along exactly the lines illustrated by contemporary work in infectious diseases, Moebius attempted to provide causal explanations of hysterical symptoms. Hysterical symptoms. What was it in the pioneering days of bacteriology and psychoanalysis alike that created an affinity between the two kinds of clinical inquiry? What was it that attracted Freud's interest in bacteriology? It was, as I will show, first of all, the call to move beyond a survey of morbid symptoms, so as to establish the underlying causes, and what is more, to establish specific causes for specific symptoms, so as to arrive at differential diagnostics and treatment. As Freud explains in one of his famous Ulrike moments of 1896, and I quote him, "What gives its distinctive character to my line of approach is that I elevate the sexual influences to the rank of specific causes, that I recognize their action in every case of neurosis, and finally, that I trace a regular parallelism, a proof of a special etiological relation between the nature of the sexual influence and the pathological species of the neurosis." Freud insisted on differentiating neurosis from neurasthenia, and the possibility of differential diagnosis and of treatment hinged on the identification of a specific cause. For him, it was the abnormalities of sexual life that constituted the necessary cause of anxiety neuroses, with hereditary disposition as a precondition or as accompanying factor, not as cause, as Ricœur had upheld it before him. While the sexual factor remained the undisputed necessary cause throughout Freud's work, the characterization of this sexual factor changed with observations gathered in the case histories and with the formation and transformation of concepts and theories. The publications of the 1890s are centrally concerned with the elaboration of an etiology of hysteria and of neuroses more generally. If Freud's and Breuer's collaboration was strained by the question of the etiological role to be accorded to sexuality, it was the issue of the ideogenic nature of pathological phenomena that showed up some serious rifts in their understanding of the etiology of hysteria. In his theoretical contribution to the studies on hysteria, Breuer critically reviews Moebius's 1894 study on hysteria, questioning the requirement of identifying a specific pathogen. Breuer completed his theoretical contribution to the studies on hysteria in May 1895. Freud, for his part, it seems, wasted no time to respond to his critics questioning the notion of a specific sexual etiology of anxiety neurosis. His paper Zur Kritik der Angstneurose, originally published in July 1895 in the Wiener Klinische Rundschau, was a rejoinder to a critique by psychiatrist Leopold Löwenfeld. As if hitting two birds with one stone, Freud simultaneously takes up the analogy that Breuer had attempted to construct between the etiology of phthisis pulmonum, as they referred to TB at the time, and the etiology of anxiety neurosis. But contrary to Breuer, Freud differentiates the various kinds of causes along some of Koch's and Klebs's criteria in a comprehensive formulation of the etiological equation, which he later on was to call the complemental series. That is, the interrelations between the different causes required for an etiology of neurosis. And he lists 4 types of causes, which I have listed here on a slide. They are, first of all, the preconditions in whose absence the effect would never come about, but which alone are incapable of producing the effect. That would correspond to one of Ricœur's and I think also Janet's causes. The second one would be, and that's Freud's most important contribution to the etiology of neurosis, would be the specific cause, which is never missing in any case in which the effect takes place. The third cause is the concurrent or auxiliary causes that comprises factors that are not necessarily present every time, nor able, whatever their amount, to produce the effect by themselves alone, but which operate alongside of the preconditions and the specific cause in satisfying the etiological equation. Freud also referred to these concurrent or auxiliary causes as stock noxe: emotion, fright, physical exhaustion, illness, or overexertion. And finally, there would be less interesting for psychoanalysis would be the precipitating or releasing cause, which immediately precedes the emergence of the effect. This cause would be of recent date, and it would be often consciously recalled by the analysand. While insisting on the identification of the specific factor as necessary cause, Freud recognizes the role of factors providing non-specific causes contributing to pathogenesis. In elaborating an account of psychophysical causation, Freud's reasoning shows very close analogies with Koch's work on microbial infections. I would go further to say that in general terms, Freud follows Koch's etiological reasoning virtually every step, including every misstep of the way. Koch's discovery of the tubercle bacillus was first presented in a paper entitled The Etiology of Tuberculosis of 1882, along with related articles published in subsequent years. These stood as the culmination of previous decades of work on wound infection. Wound infection, I think one has to remember, the Franco-Prussian War, 1870, 1871. So wound infections were a big topic in medical circles at the time. Initially, Koch went in search of necessary criteria of disease causation. This proof was stated in terms of an absence argument. Without the presence of certain bacilli, the specific disease does not occur. So this would correspond to Freud's specific cause, which is never missing in any case in which the effect takes place. So that would be, on the left-hand side, the necessary cause. So without A, there will not be a disease, specific disease B. In fine-tuning the necessary criteria, Koch stumbled upon sufficient criteria for causation. However, he battled to elaborate the criteria that would satisfy the kind of strict sufficiency proofs demanded by his contemporaries and by popular opinion. He found, for instance, that the disease agent might be something other than particular bacteria, for instance, a substance associated with bacteria, or that the agent of the disease could also occur non-pathogenically in other instances or in other hosts. That is, the bacilli could be found in asymptomatic carriers, and this was the Achilles heel of bacteriology for the next couple of decades. In fact, it was the Achilles heel even of the diagnosis of HIV in relation to AIDS in South Africa as recently as the 1980s. In analogous fashion, Freud was, sorry, I'm skipping something here. But Koch battled to elaborate the criteria that would satisfy the kind of strict sufficiency proofs that were demanded by his contemporaries. He found that there are asymptomatic carriers. Okay, this is where I had left off. In analogous fashion, Freud was baffled and challenged by the observation that the same traumatic event did not solicit the same responses in the persons subjected to it. In the face of public opinion weighing in on this matter, Freud defends his stance on the necessary condition for the causation of neurosis and on the etiological equation in direct reference to Koch's postulates. And I'd like to quote him at length here because I'd like to show you the analogies that Freud is constructing here. He says, now let us turn to the objection, which is based precisely on an acknowledgement of the frequency of infantile sexual experience and on the observed fact that many people who remember scenes of that kind have not become hysterics. Is not the tubercle bacillus ubiquitous, and is it not inhaled by far more people than are found to fall ill of tuberculosis? And is its etiological significance impaired by the fact that other factors must obviously be at work too before the tuberculosis, which is its specific effect, can be evoked? In order to establish the bacillus as the specific etiology, it is enough to show that tuberculosis cannot possibly occur without its playing a part. That's the necessary argument. The same doubtless applies to our problem, says Freud. It does not matter if many people experience infantile sexual scenes without becoming hysterics, provided only that all the people who become hysterics have experienced scenes of that kind. The area of occurrence of an etiological factor may be freely allowed to be wider than that of its effect, but it must not be narrower. Not everyone who touches or comes near a smallpox patient develops smallpox. Nevertheless, infection from a smallpox patient is almost the only known etiology of the disease. That's how far the quote goes. Working out strict sufficiency criteria became a major preoccupation for Koch in his later work. He took up Edwin Klebs's idea that tracing the invasion and the course of the microorganisms can make causality probable, but the crucial experiment is to isolate the efficient cause and allow it to operate on the organism. Koch followed suit, isolating the suspected disease agent in pure culture. It remained to be shown that animals inoculated with a pure culture would contract the same particular disease in every instance of such inoculation. This was to prove that a specific microbe is sufficient to cause a specific disease in the form of the proposition that wherever a specific agent A is present and detectable, a specific disease B must occur. That would be the sufficiency criterion. However, the sufficiency criteria elaborated by Koch proved a stumbling block for bacteriology and for modern biomedicine's account of disease in general. Koch found that in some cases of typhoid fever, diphtheria, leprosy, and cholera, it was impossible to infect animals selected for experimentation with pure cultures and thereby conclusively demonstrate the sufficiency argument. Moreover, Koch could not prove that usually pathogenic organisms could never occur non-pathogenically. He discovered the phenomenon of healthy carriers. The famous case in point is the one in which the tubercle bacilli can exist in a host without causing the disease. Similarly, it turned out that only a fraction of people infected with the cholera bacterium actually do get the disease. This possibility calls into question the strict sufficiency criterion. The presence of bacteria is not sufficient to explain the onset of disease. In such cases, Koch did not hesitate to return to the necessity argument as the main criterion for conclusively establishing causality. In such cases, he believed he was justified in stating that if the regular and exclusive occurrence of the parasite is demonstrated, the causal relationship between the parasite and the disease is validly established. Okay, now let's get back to Freud. Freud, too, adduced a necessary cause for neurosis. Wherever some commonplace emotion must be included among the determinants of the onset of the illness, he says, analysis invariably shows that it is the sexual component of the traumatic experience, a component that is never lacking, which has produced the pathogenic result. That's the necessity argument, necessary causality. At the same time, Freud ostensibly takes up Rudolf Virchow's skepticism about monocausal explanations, which ignore the role of the infected organism itself in accounts of the unfolding disease process. Freud, too, becomes alert to the fact that it is no longer a question of what sexual experiences a particular individual has had in his childhood, but rather of his reaction to those experiences, of whether he had reacted to them by repression or not. Many years later, Freud clarifies this skeptical hunch. Convinced that there is no way of finding a single, tangible, ultimate cause of neurotic illness, Freud revises his earlier methodological and theoretical reliance on Klebs's and Koch's bacteriologically based diagnosis and treatment. And I'd like to quote Freud again on that. The ideal solution, he says, which medical men no doubt still yearn for, would be to discover some bacillus which could be isolated and bred in a pure culture, and which, when injected into anyone, would invariably produce the same illness. Or to put it rather less extravagantly, to demonstrate the existence of certain chemical substances, the administration of which could bring about or cure particular neuroses. But the probability of a solution of this kind seems slight. Psychoanalysis leads to less simple and satisfactory conclusions. The less simple and less satisfactory conclusions of psychoanalysis that Freud brings into the etiological equation here stem from his own biological and phylogenetic investigations pursued in the interim, that is, specifically between 1912 and 1920, notably with Beyond the Pleasure Principle. The sexual factor remains prominent, and so does the etiological role of trauma, but now they're being threaded through considerations from evolutionary biology and phylogeny in accounting for pathogenesis. Freud summarizes these considerations in three aspects. He lists, firstly, the biological factor, that is the long period of human neoteny. Secondly, the phylogenetic factor, the traumatic upheavals in the history of the human species, which result in the interruption of sexual development, so the biphasic onset of sexuality. And thirdly, the psychological factor, which involves premature contact with the external world, early contact with traumatogenic demands of sexuality. The combination of these factors calls upon mechanisms protecting and defending against external and internal forces. Still, it remains that the chance experiences of childhood and the task of dealing with the early sexual impulses are specific causes, ontogenetically and phylogenetically understood, of neurotic illness. The concepts of Nachträglichkeit and latency assume their explanatory role here. They are described in Freud's earliest article on hysteria and in the last major study published in his lifetime in terms of the bacteriological concept of incubation period. This is the term that Freud himself uses, the incubation period, to describe latency and Nachträglichkeit. So, to get to my conclusion, the survey that I've presented here of Freud's elaboration of the etiology of neuroses indicates a number of changes and revisions. These are in no small measure related to the changes in medical and particularly bacteriological conceptualizations. How are we to think these changes? Initially, the sexual etiology of neurosis that I've traced here is stated in analogy to the bacterial etiology of certain infectious diseases in a vertical and horizontal interrelation between four terms. That is, the bacterial pathogen is to infectious disease what the traumatogenic sexual factor is to neurosis. But then, after 1906, the analogy becomes blurred, if it does not implode altogether. This is not so much due to the difficulties in adducing strongly sufficient criteria as causative factors in pathogenesis, I would argue, as it is a matter of a changed purview of bacteriology and of Freudian metapsychology itself. The bacteriological discoveries of Edwin Klebs and Robert Koch, which Freud takes as reference points, center on bacteria and bacilli as causative agents of some infectious diseases. Most species of bacteria are single-celled prokaryotic microorganisms without a nucleus. Freud, along with Ernst Haeckel at the time, called them protisten, protozoa, but they didn't make the distinction between non-nucleus and nucleus-based microorganisms. Not only were they the first forms of life on Earth, dating back 4 billion years, they were also the dominant forms of life for about 3 billion years. And they are absolutely essential to sustaining life. Freud moots the idea taken from Lipschitz that they are continuously revitalized through coalescence before reproducing through binary fission. Most bacteria in and on the human body are non-pathogenic or are rendered such by protective immune responses. But if bacteria form a parasitic association with other organisms, causing harm to their host, they are classed as pathogens. Each species of pathogen has a characteristic spectrum of interactions with its human host. A similar relation between the traumatic sexual factor and the psychic apparatus comes into focus if we view it from perspectives of evolutionary biology and phylogenesis. The disturbances of the sexual process, that is, disturbances of the processes which determine in the organism the formation and utilization of the sexual libido, are structured by repression and latency, ontogenetically and phylogenetically understood. The dependency of young humans exposed helplessly to the influences of the external world, on object relations, and their premature confrontation with the demands of sexuality is potentially traumatogenic, calling up repression and defenses against external and internal forces. Thus, the analogy between a bacteriological etiology of infectious disease and a sexual etiology of neuroses can be seen to hold in broad terms. However, with the introduction of a phylogenetic perspective, the analogy no longer stands as a model. Instead, the relation between its terms becomes part of the reality that it had set out to elucidate. It establishes pathology as constitutional factor of human life and pathoanalysis as the key for inquiries in philosophical anthropology. And I hope to hand over the creation of the link to Jenny Willner and Hermann Westering with their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike Kistner, for a very fascinating reconstruction of a rather hidden story of psychoanalysis. So I'm sure there are many questions arising. Who wants to be the first? Well, maybe I jump in to break the ice. I don't know if Möbius is the Möbius who also is the inventor of the Möbius string.
Paul Julius August Möbius, I don't know.
Do you know the Möbius string?
Yes, the Möbius
because
string.
I think
yes.
that's a very helpful concept as well, in terms of this struggling between specific and other causes, isn't it?
Yes, but I think I would need to ask you to elaborate on that.
I don't know how to show or how to illustrate the Möbius string. It is a string which goes inside out and outside in, which means it's bent in between, and it is used, at least in gender studies, as a concept of this rather difficult question between nature and nurture, because you know, you can't decide if it's inside out or outside in,
Yes.
as the string.
Yes.
But if it's not helpful, I don't want to bother you with that. Maybe there's a better question over there. Thank you.
That's another Mobius. And,
Oh, that's another Mobius.
that Mobius probably didn't deserve credit for it.
Okay, okay.
Too much information. I appreciate, this isn't exactly a question, so I appreciate the logical thinking.
Okay. This formal scientific approach or logical approach, that's, I think it tends to get overlooked. And psychoanalysis has had a reputation at times for being unscientific. That is, that it's not easily verifiable. You can't bring impartial observers into a consulting room. So it's nice to see this laid out, this Freud's thinking in this matter. Thanks.
Yes, over there. Could you hand over the microphone to the last row? Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. That was a really, really fascinating talk. I wanted to ask you about whether there's any sort of rhythm, if you like, to the emergence of Freud's reliance on these models from natural science. It struck me as you were speaking that there are moments in Freud's thinking where he is particularly focused on traumatic etiologies. And then there are moments in his thinking where traumatic etiology recedes. So obviously, the 1890s, the work with Breuer, the seduction theory, Nachträglichkeit, as you mentioned, and then later 1920, Beyond the Pleasure Principle. It seems to me that in the moments where his, shall we say, his interest in traumatic etiology recedes and he's focused much more on intrapsychic dynamics and their roles in the etiology of illness, his thinking might lend itself less obviously to these kind of bacteriological modules, which are about foreign bodies, if you like. So I wonder whether there's an extent to which Freud's reliance on those models kind of comes in and out of focus at different points in his thinking, or whether it is something that has a kind of continuous presence throughout his various different etiological, kind of different moments in his etiological thought.
Yes, I think these models are, or analogies are ubiquitous between 1893, or actually even earlier, 1892, 1906. By 1912, 13, Totem and Taboo, they recede. But I think Freud holds on to the sexual factor as the necessary cause, along the lines of Koch's postulates. And it then becomes a matter of, I think, modulating the relation between internal and external, for which I think that the bacteriological model could still stand, but it does not become explicitly referenced by Freud anymore. So the impingement or the infection by a foreign body, well, actually they're not entirely foreign bodies, and the response of the body, of the human body, to that, I think becomes possibly more of an image for Freud to work with, rather than the causality, the strict causality, the strict necessary causality, and sufficient causality.
Yes, please, Ruth.
Thank you. So I was
Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. So I was struck what you said. You mentioned very shortly the incubation period and the relation to Nachträglichkeit. So that struck me because you would say that Nachträglichkeit is something hermeneutical, interpretation about life and something happened before, etc. But would you say that that's a direct influence you mentioned, a physiological influence?
Well, yes, through redirecting the etiological equation towards biological and phylogenetic factors, I do think that the bacteriological language comes back in again. Okay. The incubation period, and this is this is literally the term that Freud uses.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Hermann Westerink?
Yes, thank you, Ulrike, for a wonderful paper. I was intrigued by the reference to infection, and it makes me wonder in how far this analogy between bacteriology and Freud's writings on etiology are actually very much confined to hysteria. Because there are moments in his writings where he mentions, I think it's in group analysis, group psychology, where he talks about hysteria as an infectious character. Right? Hysterics infect each other.
Yes.
So there's another element as well.
The group of girls.
The group of girls.
Yes.
So there is another element as well in this analogy to bacteriology, which is about the notion of infection.
Yes. Related to identification as well. Yes. Yeah.
But would you agree, or would you also say that it is especially hysteria that is suited for the analogy with bacteriology, because of the infectious?
Not in the writings of the 1890s. So hysteria is the main focus of the writings of the 1890s, but the bacteriological model would pertain to obsessional neurosis as well in the writings of the 1890s. But it is an interesting phenomenon that you mentioned, that all of a sudden it seems like it acquires a different valence with identification, and no longer, and the sexual factor being no longer that important. Interesting.
Any more questions, suggestions, remarks? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your paper. I was thinking about a kind of new relationship that Freud posits with the leaning on model and its relationship to causality. So if you would like to comment on that, because you brought us in a way different models or central metaphors to causality or mechanisms of causality, but what about this new process of leaning on which cannot be reduced to causality?
I'm not sure where that fits into the etiological equation. The leaning on would be a relation of similitude. I cannot see it quite in the terms of the analogy that Freud was working with when he was referring to bacteriological discoveries. Or maybe you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on your...
I was broadening a little bit to something else than causality that exists in Freud and cannot be in a way reduced to causality, or it's another model, I think.
Yes. I think it is a different model because it would be a relationship of resemblance, similitude, prior satisfaction, prior experiences of satisfaction, which get carried over into other domains.
Thank you.
Yes, over there. Yes, we have 3 more minutes.
Well, thank you. I would like to ask you about your interpretation of the value of analogy in the construction of your argument, because you speak of analogy between the etiology of neurosis to the etiology of infectious disease, but analogy is not identity. So if it is an analogy, it's the most, scandalous is the most unscientific operation ever. I mean, according to Aristotle, you can't construct an argument by analogy because it's like a trick of the mind, basically. So if it is an analogy, it's the most unscientific relation to something that could be considered an established science. I think we'll hear more about this tomorrow. I don't know. I don't know what you're going to say, but you're going to speak about Ferenczi, so where analogy is explicitly posed as an operation, and also Freud is very affirmative of analogy, but it remains somehow a black box, kind of an enigmatic operation between science and non-science. So I would like to hear you a bit about your interpretation of the use of the term analogy.
Mm-hmm. Maybe I would want to present a counter to your argument, to say that in the process of scientific discovery, analogies are absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, it's not my opinion.
Okay.
No, of course.
So the relationship between the bacterial pathogen and the disease has been established, or I would say roughly 10 years prior to Freud's explorations in the etiology of neurosis. He is experimenting with that relationship in trying to establish the relationship between the sexual factor and neurosis. So I think in the quest of psychoanalysis to establish itself as a science, it's taking the model that has already been established by bacteriology as a reference point and piggybacks on that for a certain amount of time, not throughout.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me.